Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In the city of Charleston, cradle of forgotten stories, the cobbled streets wound between the Victorian mansions with white columns and the decrepit houses in working-class neighborhoods, where Spanish moss hung from the branches of the ancient oaks. A city of contrasts, both beautiful and broken, like the most powerful man who lived there, Richard Donnelly. He lived in the Donnelly estate, a vast 10-hectare estate, hidden behind wrought iron gates. At 62, Richard had the face carved like a Greek statue, straight forehead, square jaw, cold gaze. But those who had known him before said that a smile had once lit up that face before the tragic death of his wife Elise, which occurred 20 years earlier during a mysterious fire in one of their hotels abroad. From that day on, Richard had locked his heart like a safe. He had raised their only son, Ethan Donnelly, in a gilded cage, with a strict education, private tutors, social invitations, but without ever telling him, "I love you." And yet, despite this environment of cold excellence, Ethan had grown up differently at 28. He was the complete opposite of his father. Gentle, reserved, involved in discreet actions for the environment, and above all passionate about botanical. His greenhouse, built at the back of the estate, was his sanctuary. "Ethan, you bear my name, but you refuse to bear my ambitions," Richard often sighed, his gaze lost in his glass of bourbon. Ethan didn't answer. He preferred to talk to Thefrance that he treated or Toby's that he had brought to a corner of the garden. He dreamed of peace, not power, of roots, not crowns. His hands felt of earth, not the cold metal of contracts. But Richard could not accept that his heir would turn his back on the empire he had built, much less that he would remain single, refusing all the heiresses that wealthy families presented to him. One spring morning, while the magnolias were blooming in the garden, Richard summoned the press. In a perfectly staged scene, he stood on the steps of the manor, in a dark suit, surrounded by cameras and flashbulbs. The rumor had been circulating for days. Richard Donnelly will announce his succession. But instead of a financial speech, Richard made a statement as strange as it was disconcerting. "My son is a good man. Too good, sometimes. He will never choose, because he doesn't believe he deserves it. He waits for love to fall on him like summer rain. So I decided to act. He won't marry an heiress, nor a salon beauty or a gilded mask. I want him to choose with his heart. But I also want the world to remember what true beauty is. Whoever brings me the most beautiful flower will marry my son." An eerie silence followed his words. Then laughter, whispers, disbelieving looks. But he was serious, and the news became viral in a few hours. The television channels spoke of him as a modern king, issuing a romantic challenge to the nation. On the networks, hashtags exploded. Hashtag Donnelly Challenge. Hashtag Flower for an Heir. Hashtag The Heart in the Root. Some cried genius, others madness. Articles were titled, "Marriage by Flower, Love According to the Rich." What if the flower hides a trap? Who will dare challenge Donnelly? And in this media uproar, Ethan, sheltered in his greenhouse, silently contemplated a jasmine seed that he had just planted. He didn't yet know that this announcement would turn not only his life upside down, but also that of a young woman he had never met, and who held the only flower Richard hadn't expected. Hundreds of suitors, private collectors, floral biologists, and plant designers from all over the world flocked to the Donnelly estate. This ancestral manor where wrought iron crossed ancient wisteria, and where the stones still seemed to mourn Elise Donnelly. For 3 days, the immense courtyard of the estate was transformed into extravagant botanical exhibition. White tents housed glass display cases, cooling systems, UV projectors, and even built-in fragrance diffusers to preserve and enhance the most delicate flowers. Drones filmed the presentations live, broadcast on social media, while stylists dressed the competitors like models for a floral parade. Each participant, hoping to seduce both Richard Donnelly and the world's spotlight, had staged his flower as a sacred work of art. Among them, Sienna Montgomery, an influencer with million subscribers, stepped out of a white limousine into a tulle dress encrusted with petals. She presented a rose gold-plated, designed indigo and set tiny diamonds along its leaves. "This flower never fades. Like the love I can promise," she said, a calculated smile on her lips. David Klein, renowned botanist, bald, round glasses, dressed as a mad professor, revealed a translucent orchid, born from 10 years of genetic manipulation. Its petals vibrated slightly at human body temperature. This flower breathes with you. It can only survive when held in a human hand, he explained, fascinated by his own creation. Grace LeBlanc, great heiress of a Texas agricultural empire, arrived on horseback, surrounded by servants carrying solar lamps. She presented a fleur photosensitive, baptized Aurelia solaris, who opened its petals only when it perceived light of an artificial sun. Beauty does not depend on the world, but on the energy we choose to give it, she said enigmatically. Every flower seemed to define nature itself. Sweet scents floated in the air. Cameras crackled. Reporters murmured. It's a war of egos, not of hearts, thought Ethan Donnelly, hidden behind a hedge of old roses, watching the masquerade with a silent gaze. But in a forgotten corner of the courtyard, in the shade of an old cypress tree, stood a young woman whom no one had noticed. Dressed in a faded green coat, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, Maya Brooks watched the scene without flinching. She wore neither makeup nor heels. On her feet, a canvas bag grated, and in his hands, a Mothis terracotta pot, worn, containing asmal flower with slightly wrinkled white petals. A chamomile. Maya was 27 years old. A horticulturist for 6 years at the retirement home in Somerville, she spent her days planting, watering, and sometimes simply holding the hands of those who no longer had anyone to listen to their silence. She lived in a small apartment with her younger sister, Lila, suffering from a mental disability. The ends of the month were often short, but she had never lacked love to give. When her turn came, she was called by a butler who was surprised to see her name on the list. The other competitors stared at her with a mixture of contempt and pity. Is that a chamomile? A voice sneered. It looks like a roadside weed, another said mockingly. Maya didn't flinch. She moved forward calmly, each step a silent protest against the arrogance surrounding her. Her muddy boots contrasted with the shiny pumps that gleamed in the spotlight. She placed her pot on the table set aside for presentations, gently wiped a dusty leaf with the back of her sleeve, then held out a handwritten envelope to the butler. It's not my flower, she said simply. It belongs to someone else. The butler frowned, quickly read the letter, then handed it to Richard, who read it aloud. My name is Eleanor Jenkins. I'm 89 years old. I was told I would never see my children again. That life was keeping me here until the end. But Maya handed me a seed and said, plant it. You never know what might grow next. I cared for this chamomile. I watered it. I spoke to it. I took care of it as if it were my future. As long as it was growing, I still felt alive. It bloomed yesterday, and I left last night. Maya promised to wear it to your competition. If this flower doesn't win, it doesn't matter. It has already saved a life. Mine. A heavy silence fell over the assembly. No more sniggering. Even the cameras seemed to have frozen. Maya, straight, hands crossed in front of her, looked at her little chamomile. She had nothing to prove. She had come as a witness, not as a rival. And without knowing it, at that precise moment, she had just planted the first seed in the heart of Richard Donnelly himself. Richard Donnelly walked the flowery paths with an almost religious slowness. For 2 whole days, dressed in a dark suit and a felt hat, he examined each plant with silent attention. He asked almost no questions. He simply looked, of to feel, of to touch sometimes a petal with the tips of the fingers, as if touching a distant memory. He observed shapes, colors, scents, but more than that, he seemed to be searching which cannot be explained what the spotlights don't see, what the windows hide. Some candidates tried to seduce him with scientific or poetic speeches. Others, frustrated by his silence, grew impatient. But Richard remained unmoved. At the end of the second day, the verdict arrived. The crowd held its breath. Cameras trained on the mansion's central staircase awaited the spectacular moment. A prestigious name, an impossible flower, a choice that would make headlines. Richard descended the steps slowly, his expression grave. Then he stopped, swept the assembly with a slow, deep look, and by Maya Brooks, still wearing her green coat, holding the terracotta pot in her hands. A murmur of shock ran through the crowd. Outraged exclamations, annoyed whispers. Richard finally spoke, his voice deep, stripped of all artifice. Many of you have presented me with exceptional flowers, marvels of science, wealth, and design. But this flower was not created to impress. It was not bred in a laboratory or sculpted to please. She has human roots. She grew up in the hands of an old woman, in a place where people prepare to die. And yet, it flourished. She reminded me why I loved my wife, Elise. Because she also taught me that life hangs by a thread, but that this thread, if we take care of it, becomes light. It is you I choose. A heavy silence fell, then chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Social media exploded with comments. Scandal. A flower of nothing at all. Emotional manipulation. Is this a publicity stunt? The simplest flower for the most coveted son. A humble heroine or a discreet con artist? Some accused Maya of using a sad story to soften Richard's feelings. Others, on the contrary, hailed her authenticity as a snub to the superficiality of the competition. Maya did not respond to any interviews. She simply returned to Somerville, returned to work at the retirement home, and continued to tend the gardens as if nothing had happened. And in the silence, Ethan, who until now had remained discreet and almost invisible in this public affair, made his own choice. One foggy morning, several days after the commotion, Maya heard a knock at the gate of the community garden where she worked as a volunteer. She opened it. Ethan Donnelly stood there. He wore a simple jacket, dusty jeans, and in his hands, a wicker basket filled with seeds. No cameras, no reporters, just him. He approached quietly, placed the basket on a wooden bench, and looked her straight in the eyes. I have never liked perfect flowers. They always look sad. If you want, we can plant them together and see what happens. He didn't reach out to her. He didn't try to kiss her. He offered a seed, a beginning. Maya stared at him for a moment. She saw in his eyes the same quiet tenderness that she felt with her gentlest borders. She nodded. Yes, let's see what happens. And that day they planted, side by side, silent, present, a row of nasturtiums, basil seeds, a few poppies, no kissing, no oaths, more two hearts in conversation who were learning to grow together. And in the middle of the garden, in a corner a little out of the way, Eleanor's chamomile continued to live. Small, fragile, but undefeated. The months passed like a slow breath. Richard Donnelly, once steadfast, began to show signs of fatigue no one had wanted to see. An illness he kept secret, like a secret too heavy to share, was slowly eating away at his powerful body. In the solitude of his study, surrounded by old portraits and heavy leather books, Richard wrote a will that shocked everyone who read it after his death. He devoted a large part of his fortune to it, not to businesses or banks, but to a project he had imagined in silence, inspired by the simplicity and strength of Maya's chamomile and Eleanor's wisdom. This foundation would be called Eleanor's Gardens, a place of reconciliation between generations, a haven for those whom society forgets, isolated elderly people, abandoned children, nature lovers without resources. A project to cultivate not only flowers, but above all connections. Richard designated Maya and Ethan as the guardians of this vision, an unexpected but deeply sincere choice, which finally sealed the reconciliation between father and son. 2 years later, under a clear spring sky, the first ceremony was held in the very first Eleanor Garden, nestled in the heart of a modest neighborhood of Charleston. Where once there was only concrete and silence, now flourished rows of wildflowers, colorful vegetables, and spaces for children to play, learn, and marvel. Children laughed as they dug the earth. Elders told their memories while planting seeds. Homeless people came looking for a little peace, dignity, all united by the simple magic of the garden. In the center, on a rough wooden platform, Ethan and Maya stood side by side. Their hands brushed, then met. Not out of obligation, but out of a deep connection. Ethan addressed the assembly in a clear, gentle voice. The most beautiful flower has no specific color. It is not rare. It is neither the tallest nor the brightest. The most beautiful flower is the one that grows in a heart capable of loving despite storms and seasons. The one who refuses to give up, even when all seems lost. A murmur of emotion ran through the crowd. At the bottom of the garden, in the shade of an oak tree, a small chamomile bush was thriving. Not the most majestic, not the most dazzling, but the one who had changed an empire. An empire of stone and steel had given way to an empire of life and hope. And in this garden, each flower told a story of love, resilience, and rebirth.